There is a sound that exists in this world that no engineer has ever been able to fully explain, and no competitor has ever been able to fully replicate. It begins as a low mechanical whisper, rising through a register that doesn't quite belong in the vocabulary of internal combustion. It builds, it climbs, it stretches into something between a scream and a song. And if you have ever heard it disappear down a mountain road at full throttle, you understand immediately at a cellular level that you are in the presence of something that was never quite supposed to exist. That sound belongs to a flat-six engine mounted backwards over the rear axle of a machine that every aerodynamicist, every racing physicist, every rational engineer in the 1960s told its creators would be fundamentally, dangerously, catastrophically wrong. They told Ferry Porsche's son that the weight was in the wrong place, that the car would spin out, that the laws of physics themselves were stacked against it. They were not wrong about the physics. They were just wrong about what the car would eventually become. This is the story of the Porsche 911. Not just a car, not just an icon, a machine that was born from grief, shaped by argument, nearly killed by the company that made it, and saved by a small group of men who believed so deeply in what they had created that they risked everything to protect it. A car that became the only automobile in history to remain in continuous production for over 60 years, while retaining the essential architecture of its original design. A machine that taught the world that wrong, when handled correctly, can become legendary. But before we get to the legend, we need to understand the silence that preceded it, because every great story begins not with the triumph, but with the quiet desperation that made the triumph necessary. In the summer of 1963, in the industrial city of Stuttgart, Germany, a man stood in a design studio and looked at a car that was already becoming obsolete. His name was Ferry Porsche, and the car was the 356, the machine his company had built from almost nothing in the ruins of post-war Austria, assembled by hand from borrowed Volkswagen parts in a makeshift workshop that looked more like a barn than a factory. The 356 had made Porsche famous. It had proven that a small company with no money and enormous ambition could build something worthy of the name on its flanks. It was elegant, it was quick for its era, and it was deeply, structurally, mechanically limited. The world was changing. The American market was hungry for performance. Ferrari and Aston Martin were redefining what a grand touring sports car could be. Even Chevrolet had just launched the Stingray Corvette, a machine that made the 356 look like something your grandmother might drive to the market on a Sunday afternoon. Ferry Porsche knew what everyone in the room knew, but no one wanted to say out loud. The car that had built his company was running out of time. But here is what made that moment extraordinary, rather than simply difficult. Because most companies, when confronted with the obsolescence of their flagship product, go to their engineers and say, "Give us something bigger, faster, more powerful, more modern. Give us what the market wants." Ferry Porsche did something different. He went to his son. Ferdinand Alexander Porsche, known to everyone who knew him as Butzi, was 27 years old, trained as a designer rather than an engineer, and possessed of an aesthetic sensibility that was almost the opposite of his father's generation. Where Ferry thought in terms of what was practical and possible, Butzi thought in terms of what was pure and beautiful. Where the engineers wanted evolution, Butzi wanted a statement. And the statement he began to sketch on paper in that Stuttgart studio would become, over the following 2 years, the most consequential design in automotive history. He drew a long hood. He drew a cabin set back dramatically over the rear wheels. He drew fenders with a muscular, organic swell that suggested both motion and restraint. He drew a roofline that swept in a single, unbroken arc from the windshield to the tail. And beneath that roofline, he created the silhouette that would remain essentially unchanged for the next 6 decades. When he showed the finished clay model to his father and the board of Porsche in early 1963, there was silence in the room. Not the silence of confusion, not the silence of polite reservation, the silence of people looking at something that they recognized on some pre-rational level as being exactly right. The car debuted at the Frankfurt Motor Show in September of 1963, and it was displayed not as a production model, but as a prototype, carrying the designation 901. And here, already, we encounter the first of several moments in the 911's history where the story could have ended before it truly began. Because standing in that Frankfurt show hall, looking at the 901 with an expression that mixed admiration with cold fury, were representatives from Peugeot. The French automaker had, quite legally, trademarked a naming convention for automobiles, 3 digits with a 0 in the middle: the 901, the 903, the 905. All of them, according to Peugeot's lawyers, belonged to Peugeot. Ferry Porsche received the legal notice and made a decision in approximately 10 minutes. Change the designation. The 0 became a 1. The 901 became the 911. It is almost impossible to imagine that name belonging to any other configuration of numbers, but the truth is that it came about not through inspiration, but through the threat of a lawsuit. The 911 went on sale in September of 1964, and what the first buyers found when they climbed inside was something that felt at once both deeply familiar and utterly unlike anything they had experienced before. Now here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. Imagine you are a driver in 1964. You have owned cars all your adult life, perhaps a Mercedes, perhaps a BMW, perhaps even a Ferrari if you were doing particularly well. You understand how cars work. The engine is in the front. The weight sits over the front axle. You turn the wheel, the nose follows, and the rear stays planted and obedient behind you. Now someone hands you the keys to a machine where all of that is reversed, where the engine hangs out behind the rear axle in a place where no mechanical reasoning suggests it should be. Would you have trusted it? Would you have believed that something so structurally unconventional could behave under the hands of an ordinary driver, not just safely, but beautifully? The engineers at Porsche were not entirely sure. And that uncertainty would define the first decade of the 911's existence in ways that almost nobody talks about. The engine that powered the original 911 was, in itself, a radical departure from anything the company had previously attempted. It was a flat 6 cylinders arranged horizontally, 3 on each side of a central crankshaft, air-cooled, because Porsche's entire engineering philosophy, inherited from Ferdinand Porsche Sr.'s work at Volkswagen, was built around the simplicity and mechanical reliability of air cooling. No water, no radiator, no coolant lines, no freeze risk, no burst hoses, just metal, oil, and moving air. The engine displaced 2.0 liters and produced 130 horsepower, which sounds modest by modern standards, but was, in 1964, enough to propel the car to a top speed of 131 miles per hour and reach 60 miles per hour from rest in just over 8 seconds. But the numbers, important as they were not the point. The point was what this engine communicated, because the flat 6, mounted behind the rear axle, produced a sound and a feeling of mechanical engagement that was unlike anything in the world. The throttle response was immediate in a way that front-engined cars simply could not match, because there was no distance, no mechanical delay, no massive transmission and drive shaft separating the driver's right foot from the rear wheels. The power was immediate. The response was telepathic. And the sound, that flat percussive howl building through the rev range, was something that the first owners described in terms that sounded more like music criticism than automotive journalism. The suspension, too, was a revelation. Porsche used a McPherson strut setup at the front, and a trailing arm arrangement at the rear, and the result was a ride quality that was, by the standards of 1964, astonishingly composed. The car absorbed bumps and road imperfections with a suppleness that no one had expected from something so light and so stiff. It felt to the drivers who pushed it as if it were alive, as if it were participating in the act of driving rather than simply being driven. And then, for certain drivers in certain situations, it did something terrifying. The technical term for what happens when you push a rear-engined car beyond its limits of adhesion is oversteer. In most cars, when the rear steps out, the process is gradual, progressive, readable. The driver gets a warning. There is time to correct. But in the early 911, with that heavy flat six cantilevered out behind the rear axle, the transition from grip to oversteer could be sudden and violent in a way that caught experienced drivers completely off guard. The back end would come loose, and it would come loose quickly, and if you were not precise and immediate in your correction, the car would spin. And a spinning car on a mountain road does not end the story in a way that anyone wants to read. The German press coined a phrase that haunted the 911 through its early years. Widowmaker. It was unfair. Many of the accidents were caused by drivers who pushed the car into situations that any vehicle would have found terminal. But it was not entirely without foundation. There was a genuine handling challenge at the limit, and it needed to be addressed. The solution, when it came, was born not in the boardroom, but on the racetrack. Because almost from the moment of its launch, the 911 had begun to race. Not because Porsche's management had ordered it, but because the drivers who bought the car simply could not resist taking it to the circuit and discovering what it was truly capable of. And what they discovered was that the same rear weight bias that made the car challenging on the road became, in the hands of a skilled racing driver, a weapon. The rear heavy weight distribution gave the 911 a natural tendency to rotate under hard cornering. Where a conventional front-engined sports car needed to be wrestled through a turn, the 911 could be placed precisely and then, with the right throttle input, pivoted around its rear axle with an accuracy and a fluidity that no front-engined rival could replicate. On the right road, in the right hands, it was not a dangerous car. It was a devastatingly effective one. Porsche formalized what the racers had discovered. In 1966, they homologated the 911 for international motorsport competition. In 1967, a 911 won its class at the Monte Carlo Rally. In 1968, with a modified suspension and a torque tube added to the driveline for better weight distribution. The handling balance improved dramatically even for road cars. And in 1969, Porsche added wider rear wheels and moved the front wheels forward slightly, a subtle geometric change that had an enormous effect on the car's dynamic character. The Widowmaker reputation faded. What remained was the performance. Through the late 1960s, the 911 grew. The engine displacement expanded to 2.2 liters, then 2.4. Power climbed steadily. But it was in 1972 that the 911 arrived at what many of its devotees consider its first moment of true greatness, the Carrera RS 2.7. The story of the Carrera RS begins with a number, 500. That was the minimum number of road cars that homologation rules required Porsche to build in order to qualify a vehicle for racing in the Group 4 category. The plan was to build exactly 500. What Porsche did not anticipate was the response. The Carrera RS 2.7 went on sale at the Paris Motor Show in October of 1972 with a price tag that was, for a Porsche, considerable. Within hours of the announcement, orders exceeded the minimum production requirement. Within days, they had doubled it. By the time production ended, Porsche had built 1,580 examples, more than 3 times the required number, and had created, almost accidentally, the car that would define what the 911 was supposed to be. The 2.7 RS was, by the standards of 1972, absurdly light. Porsche had stripped away every gram that could be removed without compromising structural integrity. Thin-gauge steel for the body panels, no rear seats, no sound deadening. Thin glass in the windows, a stripped interior that communicated with absolute clarity the car's purpose. The engine, now 2.7 litres, producing 210 horsepower, was mounted lower in the chassis to reduce the polar moment of inertia, meaning that it changed direction faster, responded more quickly, felt lighter in the hands of the driver. The aerodynamics were addressed with a fiberglass front spoiler and the now iconic ducktail rear spoiler, a small, elegant strip of material that reduced lift at the rear axle and became, immediately, one of the most recognizable design elements in automotive history. The RS 2.7 would go on to win its class and finish 7th overall at Le Mans in 1973. It would take the European GT Championship. It would become the foundation on which Porsche built the 911 RSR race car, which would go on to a series of victories that established the 911 as the dominant force in GT racing for the remainder of the decade. But perhaps more importantly, the RS 2.7 demonstrated something to the people inside Porsche who were already beginning to question whether the 911 had a future, that there was an audience, a passionate and loyal audience, for whom the 911 was not just a sports car, but a philosophy, a way of approaching the relationship between driver and machine that no other manufacturer was offering. That audience was about to be tested, because in 1972, the same year the RS 2.7 was born, the man who would spend the better part of the next decade trying to kill the 911 joined Porsche as its new chief executive. His name was Ernst Fuhrmann, and he was not a villain. He was a brilliant engineer, the man who had designed the legendary four-cam Carrera engine of the 1950s, and he was responding, in what he believed was a rational way, to a genuine threat. The oil crisis of 1973 had changed the world. Fuel prices had quadrupled. Emissions regulations were tightening in America, which was Porsche's most important market. The heavyweight, fuel-hungry, air-cooled flat six at the heart of the 911 was looking increasingly like a liability, and Fuhrmann had a replacement in mind. The car that Fuhrmann wanted to replace the 911 was a water-cooled, front-engined grand touring car that he believed would be more practical, more fuel-efficient, more acceptable to the regulators, and more appealing to the mainstream buyer. It was called the 928, and it was, by any objective measure, a magnificent machine. A 4.5-litre V8, a beautifully integrated body by Anatole Lapine, a torsion bar rear suspension that gave it astonishing ride quality. The 928 won the European Car of the Year award in 1978. It was fast, it was comfortable, it was sophisticated. And Fuhrmann's plan, explicit and documented, was to use the 928 as the foundation on which Porsche's future would be built, phasing out the 911 as demand declined. There was just one problem: demand did not decline. Throughout the mid-1970s, even as the oil crisis bit and fuel prices climbed and emissions regulations tightened, people kept buying the 911. They bought the Targa, the open-topped variant with its distinctive roll bar. They bought the newly launched Turbo, announced in 1974 and put into production in 1975. A car that took the 911's fundamental architecture and added over the rear axle a massive KKK turbocharger that boosted output from the 3.0-litre engine to 260 horsepower, making it the fastest accelerating production car in the world at the time of its launch. The Turbo, known internally as the 930, introduced a new dimension of danger to the 911's character. The turbocharger of the era had a significant lag. You pressed the throttle, and for a moment, nothing happened, and then everything happened simultaneously. The boost arriving in a single violent surge that could catch an unprepared driver completely off guard in the middle of a corner. Porsche's engineers had given it the largest rear spoiler in production car history, a whale tail of fiberglass so enormous it was almost comedic, not for aesthetics but out of aerodynamic necessity to manage the lift generated at speed. The 930 Turbo was genuinely ferocious, genuinely quick, and genuinely demanding. Motorsport magazine called it a car for experts only. Road and Track said that driving it in wet conditions required the utmost concentration and skill. It was the first Porsche that could genuinely kill you without warning, and people bought it as fast as the factory could build it. Fuhrmann watched the 911's continued commercial success with growing frustration. His replacement strategy was not working. The 928, for all its engineering excellence, was not converting 911 buyers. The customers who walked into Porsche dealerships wanted the thing with the engine in the wrong place, the flat six howl, the pure mechanical connection. They did not want a water-cooled, front-engined Grand Tourer, however beautifully engineered it might be. They wanted the 911, and they were willing to pay for it, and no amount of corporate strategy was going to change that. But Fuhrmann was not yet finished. In 1977, he made a decision that would strip the 911 of one of its most fundamental engineering principles. He approved the development of a new 3.0-liter engine, the Type 930/2, but with a crucial change. The engine, for the first time in 911 history, would use hydraulic valve adjusters rather than the traditional manual adjustment system. It was a practical decision, reducing maintenance intervals and addressing customer complaints about the need for regular valve adjustments. But to the engineers who had built the 911, it felt like an admission. It felt like the beginning of the softening. This brings us to the man who saved the 911. His name is Peter Schutz, and without him, there is a meaningful chance that the car you see on the road today, the car whose descendants still carry that essential rear-engined, air-cooled DNA, would not exist. Schutz arrived as Porsche's chief executive in January of 1981, having previously run the Cummins engine company in the United States. He was not a car person in the conventional sense. He was a businessman, a pragmatist, a man who made decisions based on what the data said rather than what the engineers believed. And one of the first things he did after arriving at Porsche was ask a question that nobody had thought to ask. He walked through the factory and saw the production lines. He saw the 928 line and the 944 line and the 911 line. And he noticed that the 911 line had been kept deliberately short, that the engineers and planners had been gradually, quietly winding it down, building inventory for the anticipated phase-out, treating the 911 as a car in its final years. He asked when production was scheduled to end. He was told that the plan was to discontinue the 911 by the mid-1980s. And Schutz did something that changed automotive history. He walked to the chart that showed the 911's production forecast with its downward slope toward termination, and he physically turned the line upward. He made a decision, in that moment, without committee consultation or market research or engineering review, that the 911 was not going to die. It was going to grow. Schutz's reasoning was not sentimental. It was commercial. The 911 was, consistently, the most profitable car that Porsche built. Its customers were loyal to a degree that bordered on obsession. The waiting lists were long. The residual values were strong. And crucially, the car had an identity, a coherent, recognizable, emotionally resonant identity that the 928 and the 944, for all their technical excellence, could not match. To discontinue the 911 was not just to kill a car. it was to destroy the most valuable brand asset that Porsche possessed. He put the full resources of the company behind the 911's development. He approved the cabriolet, which had been sitting in development for years, stalled by Fuhrmann's indifference. He approved a new, more powerful turbocharged variant. And he gave the engineers a mandate that would define Porsche's philosophy for the next 4 decades: make the 911 better, not different, better. What the engineers did next was one of the great stories of systematic improvement in automotive history. Now here is something worth considering. By the early 1980s, the 911 was 17 years old. It had been in continuous production longer than most of its competitors had existed at all. Every automotive logic said that a car of that age needed replacement. The platform was aging. The aerodynamics, by modern standards, were compromised. The engine technology, though continuously refined, was based on principles established in the early 1960s. And yet the team at Porsche, led by engineering director Helmut Bott, chassis wizard Peter Falk, and a generation of young engineers who had grown up with the 911 as their fundamental reference point, proceeded to make it faster, safer, more capable, and more refined than anything it had previously been, without compromising the fundamental character that made it irreplaceable. The 3.2-litre engine of 1984 was the most significant internal improvement since the car's launch. New Bosch Motronic engine management, a revised Bosch fuel injection system, a new chain tensioner that addressed one of the engine's few remaining reliability concerns, a redesigned intake manifold. The result was 231 horsepower in naturally aspirated form and a level of drivability that the earlier engines, with their more demanding maintenance requirements and less sophisticated fuel delivery, had never achieved. The car started reliably in cold weather. It idled smoothly. It delivered its power in a way that was progressive and linear and predictable. The wild, demanding, occasionally terrifying character of the early 911 was being refined and shaped into something that was still intensely engaging but no longer genuinely intimidating for a skilled driver. The turbo, meanwhile, had been evolving along a parallel track. The 930's reputation for sudden, violent power delivery, its tendency to deliver all 300 horsepower in what felt like a single detonation rather than a smooth build, had softened somewhat with each successive year's refinement. But it remained one of the most challenging cars in production to drive at the limit. Porsche's solution, when it arrived, was elegant and simple: intercooling. By cooling the compressed air from the turbocharger before it entered the engine, the density of the charge increased, allowing more fuel to be burned and more power to be extracted from the same turbocharger. But the more important effect was on power delivery. The intercooled turbo of 1977, the 930/60, was not only more powerful at 300 horsepower, it was more controllable. The power came in more gradually. The lag, though still present, was less violent in its resolution. The car became, for the first time, something that a skilled, but not necessarily expert driver could enjoy fully, rather than merely survive. On the racing front, the 911 was entering a period of dominance so complete that it bordered on the unfair. The Carrera RSR had been winning GT races since 1973. The 935, a heavily modified racing variant that retained only the roof and doors from the production car, took the World Championship of Makes in 1976, 1977, and 1978, and won the 24 Hours of Le Mans in 1979, driven by the Creamer brothers' private team in one of the most celebrated privateer victories in the race's history. The 936, a full prototype that used the turbocharged flat six in a purpose-built racing chassis, won Le Mans in 1976, 1977, and 1981. And in 1983, the 956, a ground effects prototype, powered by a twin-turbocharged version of the flat-six engine, producing over 600 horsepower, simply annihilated the opposition at Le Mans, finishing first, second, and third, and setting a new lap record. The 956 and its successor, the 962, would win Le Mans 6 times in 7 years. The engine, at the heart of all these victories, was a direct descendant of the unit that Ferry Porsche's engineers had designed in 1963. Does it not seem remarkable to you that a single basic engine architecture, conceived in a design studio at the beginning of the 1960s, could still be winning the world's most prestigious endurance race 20 years later? That a layout considered fundamentally wrong by the engineering establishment could prove so adaptable, so resilient, so genuinely excellent that it would outlast every alternative that was pitched against it. There is something in that story that goes beyond engineering. It speaks to a kind of rightness, not the obvious rightness of conventional wisdom, but the deeper rightness of something that has been conceived in complete integrity with its own principles. In August of 1991, Porsche quietly completed what would become one of the most consequential pieces of engineering work in the company's history. It was called Project 964, and it was the first systematic, ground-up revision of the 911's basic architecture since the car's introduction in 1964. 85% of the car's components were new. The suspension was completely redesigned. McPherson struts at the front replaced the old torsion bars, and a new multi-link rear suspension addressed the handling limitations that had haunted the car through its first 2 decades. Anti-lock brakes arrived for the first time, as did power steering. A new 3.6-liter engine produced 250 horsepower in naturally aspirated form. And the body was refined aerodynamically for the first time since Butzi Porsche's original design, with flush-fitting windows, a retractable rear spoiler that deployed automatically at speed, and subtle changes to the front and rear aprons that reduced drag without compromising the essential shape. The 964 was, by any objective measure, a better car than its predecessors. It was faster, safer, more comfortable, more fuel-efficient, more compliant at low speeds. It was the 911 finally arriving at the level of sophistication that its rivals had achieved years earlier. And yet, and this is perhaps the strangest chapter in the 911's entire history, the 964 was also, for many of the car's most devoted owners, a disappointment. The problem was not what it did. The problem was what it lost. The older 911s, particularly the 3.2 Carrera that the 964 replaced, had a rawness, a directness, a mechanical specificity that the new car, with its power steering and anti-lock brakes and automatically deploying spoiler, had smoothed away. The new car was easier to drive. It was more forgiving. And for the purists who had chosen the 911 precisely because it was unforgiving, precisely because it demanded skill and rewarded commitment, the forgiveness felt like a betrayal. Porsche heard the criticism and responded in the most Porsche way imaginable, by building a version of the 964 with everything taken away. The RS, the Carrera RS 3.8, built in 1992 and 1993, stripped the car back to its bones. No power steering, no sound insulation, no rear seats, racing bucket seats standard equipment. The engine bored out to 3.8 liters, producing 300 horsepower. The suspension lowered and stiffened to the point where driving it on a normal road required a kind of focused attention that bordered on meditation. It was, almost universally, described as one of the greatest driving experiences available for any amount of money. It was also completely exhausting. The tension at the heart of the 911, between accessibility and purity, between road manners and driver engagement, between being a car that anyone could enjoy and a car that only the committed deserved. This tension had been present since 1964, and it never went away. Every generation of the car navigated it differently. Every new 911 was criticized by a faction of its predecessor's owners for being too soft, too easy, too compromised. And every new 911, when driven back-to-back with the car that preceded it, revealed that the critics, despite being emotionally correct, were technically wrong. The new car was always faster, always safer, always more capable, and the essential character, that rear-engined flat-six, hands-on-the-wheel and pay-attention character, was always unmistakably there. In 1997, Porsche released the 993 Turbo S, and in doing so, built what many of its customers still describe as the greatest 911 ever made. But the 993 was also, at the same moment, the last of its kind. It was the last production 911 to use the air-cooled engine. The flat-six that had defined the car for 33 years, that had traced its lineage directly back to Ferry Porsche's original design philosophy, that had made that sound on every mountain road in the world. Because in 1998, the car changed. The 996 was the 911 that Porsche needed to survive the 21st century, and the 911 that broke the hearts of everyone who loved it for what it had always been. The engine was water-cooled for the first time in the car's history. Not because Porsche's engineers had given up on air cooling. They had not. But because the emission regulations of the new century, tightening across every major market in the world, simply could not be met by an air-cooled engine. The physics of combustion and catalysis required temperature management that air cooling could not provide consistently enough to satisfy the regulators. The decision was made, and it was made not by commercial strategy, but by environmental legislation. The air-cooled era was over. The 996 was greeted with genuine mourning in some quarters. Owners of older 911s who had grown up with the percussive, mechanical, utterly distinctive howl of the air-cooled flat-six found the water-cooled engine's note smoother, more refined, less passionate. They were right. It was. The 996 was also, in its early years, plagued by a reliability issue that became one of the most discussed mechanical problems in modern automotive history. The intermediate shaft bearing, a component in the engine's timing system that in certain conditions and at certain mileages could fail catastrophically. The IMS bearing, as it came to be known, became the reason that 996 sold for significantly less on the used market than their predecessors, and remains today a consideration that any buyer of an early water-cooled 911 needs to address. But stripped of the grief and the engineering controversy, what the 996 actually was, as a driving machine, as a performer, as an evolution of the idea that Ferry Porsche and Butzi Porsche had conceived in the early 1960s, was extraordinary. It was lighter than its predecessor. It was more aerodynamically efficient. It handled with a precision and composure that the 993, for all its emotional appeal, could not match. And the turbo variant, launched in 2000 with all-wheel drive as standard and twin turbochargers producing 420 horsepower, was the most complete performance car in the world at any price point. Not the most emotional, not the most raw, the most complete. Here, in the middle of the 911's long story, is a question that gets at something deeper than engineering or performance data. What is it that makes a car legendary? Not just successful, not just technically accomplished, but legendary. The kind of machine that generates a literature, that inspires obsession, that changes the way people think about what a car can be. Because the 911 had achieved that status by the time the air-cooled era ended, and it had achieved it not despite its contradictions, but because of them. The rear-engined layout that the engineers said was wrong. The air cooling that the regulators eventually made impossible. The handling that rewarded skill and punished carelessness. The sound that no one could explain and no one could replicate. Each of these things, each compromise, each unconventional decision, each departure from conventional engineering wisdom, contributed to a character so specific, so coherent, so authentically itself that it became not just a car, but a reference point, a standard against which every other sports car was, consciously or not, measured. The 997, launched in 2004, is where the modern 911 story truly begins. Porsche addressed the reliability concerns of the 996 systematically and thoroughly. The IMS bearing issue was resolved. The body was redesigned, subtly, because the essential shape needed no reinvention, only refinement, with wider hips, more muscular haunches, and a more pronounced front air intake that gave it a presence on the road that the 996 had lacked. The engine grew to 3.6 liters in the Carrera and 3.8 in the S variant. And the chassis engineers, building on the lessons of every previous generation, produced a suspension and steering system so communicative and so responsive that contemporary road testers struggled to find the language to describe it. It was, the reviewers said, as if the car could feel the road surface through its tires and transmit that information directly to the driver's hands and fingertips. It was as if the car was not merely being driven, but was actively collaborating with the person at the wheel, offering information, suggesting adjustments, rewarding inputs with a clarity of response that no other car in the world could match. The GT3, the RS, the Turbo, each variant of the 997 generation developed a following so devoted that pre-owned examples today sell for multiples of their original list prices. The 997 GT3 RS 4.0, built in 2011 and limited to 600 examples worldwide, with its naturally aspirated 4.0-liter flat, 6 screaming to 8,400 revolutions per minute and producing 500 horsepower, is considered by many serious drivers to be the finest road car of the 21st century. Not the fastest, not the most technologically advanced. The finest, meaning the most complete expression of what a car can be when it is designed not to impress a specification sheet, but to communicate directly with the person driving it. The 991 generation, launched in 2012, brought the 911 into a new mechanical era. The wheelbase grew, the body dimensions increased, and in 2016, the most consequential powertrain change since the switch to water cooling. The flat-six engine went turbocharged across the entire range, even in the base Carrera. The naturally aspirated Carrera engine, the one that had been a defining characteristic of the non-turbo 911 since the beginning, was gone. The response from the community was, predictably, divisive. The turbocharged engines were faster, significantly faster. The 0 to 60 time for the Carrera dropped below 4 seconds. Fuel efficiency improved. The torque curve filled out in a way that made the car more tractable in everyday driving. And yet the specific acoustic character of the naturally aspirated flat six, that rising, building, increasingly urgent howl as the engine climbed through the rev range, was blunted by the turbochargers. The car was better by every measurable metric, and for many owners, worse in the one dimension that mattered most, the feeling of being connected through the engine's sound and its mechanical soul to something irreplaceable. Porsche responded, as it always had, by building a purer version. The 991.1 GT3 and its successors retained naturally aspirated engines, while the rest of the range went turbocharged, preserving the character for those who needed it most. And in the GT3's engine, a 4.0-liter flat six derived directly from racing technology, revving to 9,000 RPM and producing a sound that automotive journalists called the last great naturally aspirated symphony, the tradition found its most extreme and most glorious expression. There is something that needs to be said about what the 911 means to the people who have built and driven and loved it. Something that goes beyond the engineering and the racing history and the production figures. The 911 has, over the course of its 6-decade existence, developed a relationship with its owners that is unlike anything else in the automotive world. Porsche owners are, as a group, among the most knowledgeable, most loyal, most obsessive enthusiasts in any product category. They form clubs, they attend events, they read technical manuals for pleasure. They spend hours debating the relative merits of different generations, different engine configurations, different suspension setups. And they buy and sell and collect 911s the way serious collectors accumulate art, with a combination of aesthetic passion and financial calculation that produces consistently some of the strongest residual values in the automotive market. The 993 Turbo S that you could have bought new in 1997 for approximately $150,000 is today worth, in good condition, somewhere between $300,000 and $500,000. The original 2.7 RS, available new for roughly $10,000 in 1973, has sold at auction for over $1 million. The early 911s from the mid-1960s, the cars that were produced in small numbers, the T and S and E variants that populated the original model range, have appreciated to values that their original owners, many of whom traded them in for newer models without a second thought, would find almost incomprehensible. And the newer generation of air-cooled enthusiasts, the collectors who entered the market in the 2000s and 2010s specifically to acquire the pre-996 cars before they became prohibitively expensive, have in many cases seen returns on their investments that rival the equity markets. But the financial story, however remarkable, is not the most important one. The most important story is this. Of all the cars that have ever been produced in large numbers, the Porsche 911 is the one most consistently described by the people who own and drive it as a relationship rather than a possession. Drivers talk about their 911s in terms that belong to the vocabulary of personal connections. Trust, communication, honesty, character, personality. They talk about the car, rewarding them for improvement, for learning its preferences, for understanding its language. They talk about the experience of driving it as something that develops over time, that deepens rather than diminishes with familiarity. That is an extraordinary thing. Most cars, driven regularly for several years, become ordinary. The initial excitement fades. The novelty disappears. What remains is a machine for getting from one place to another. The 911 uniquely does not seem to work this way. The drivers who love it describe a quality of engagement that does not diminish, that seems to offer, on every drive, a new layer of communication, a new reward for skill and attention. It is as if the car was designed, intentionally or not, to resist the entropy of familiarity, to remain always slightly ahead of the driver, offering more than is currently being asked of it, inviting rather than demanding the next level of commitment. The 992 generation, launched in 2019, is the 911 as it exists today. The architecture remains essentially unchanged from Butzi Porsche's 1963 design: engine at the rear, 2 seats in front, 2 occasional seats behind, a roofline that sweeps from windshield to tail in a single, unbroken arc. The engineering beneath that architecture is naturally contemporary. Active engine mounts, wet sump lubrication that has replaced the traditional dry sump system in most variants, an 8-speed PDK dual-clutch transmission that shifts faster than any human hand could manage, electronic stability systems of extraordinary sophistication that monitor and adjust the car's dynamics hundreds of times per second. And the GT cars, the GT3, the GT3 RS, the GT3 Touring, carry within them a naturally aspirated 4.0-litre flat-six engine that is so deeply rooted in the tradition of the car's founding philosophy that driving one feels somehow like an act of continuity. The sound is different from 1964. The power is vastly greater. The chassis is incomparably more sophisticated. But the fundamental experience, the immediate throttle response, the precise steering, the way the car rotates under hard cornering, the sense of being in direct, unfiltered communication with a machine that is asking something of you. That fundamental experience is recognizably, unmistakably, the same. Ferry Porsche, who lived until 1998 and saw the 911 evolve through 7 generations before his death, once said something that every person who has ever driven one of his family's cars, from the very first 356 assembled in the Gmund barn to the latest 992 GT3, would recognize as true. He said, "The perfect sports car is one that fulfills its driver's wishes more quickly than seems humanly possible." It is a simple statement, and it is, as a description of what the 911 has always done and what it continues to do, better than anything else on 4 wheels. Exactly right. What remains then is the question of what comes next. Because the world is changing again, in ways that make the change from air cooling to water cooling seem, by comparison, almost trivial. Electrification is reshaping the automotive industry with a speed and a thoroughness that makes the oil crisis of 1973 look like a mild inconvenience. The flat-six engine, turbocharged or naturally aspirated, air-cooled or water-cooled, is a technology that belongs to the age of combustion, and that age is ending. Porsche knows this. The Taycan, launched in 2019, demonstrated that Porsche could build an electric car with genuine performance credibility, that the brand's values of precision and driver engagement could survive the transition from combustion to electricity. The Taycan is, on its own terms, an extraordinary car, faster in a straight line than almost anything on the road, with a handling precision that reflects decades of Porsche chassis development wisdom. But it is not a 911. It does not sound like a 911. It does not feel like a 911. And the sound and the feel are not peripheral attributes. They are the core of what the 911 is. Porsche has committed to keeping the 911 as a combustion-powered vehicle for as long as regulations allow. A commitment that, depending on the market and the jurisdiction, may last through the 2030s. But the trajectory is clear. The end of the combustion-powered 911 will come. It may come as a hybrid, as Porsche has already experimented with on the GT cars. It may come as a final purely combustion-powered special edition, a send-off for the Flat Six that will be, if it happens, the most emotional product launch in automotive history. Or it may come quietly, as the regulations tighten and the thresholds are passed and the decisions are made not in design studios but in legislative chambers. When it comes, it will be the end of something that the automotive world will not see again. Not the end of the 911 as a model designation. That name may outlast us all, attached to whatever machine Porsche builds in the decades ahead. But the end of the specific, irreplaceable, physically impossible experience of sitting in a compact rear-engine sports car and hearing, through the firewall and the seat and the soles of your shoes, the sound of a flat-six engine located exactly where no engineer in their right mind would put it, doing exactly what no automotive orthodoxy said it should be capable of, perfectly and beautifully and without apology. There is a mountain pass in the Austrian Alps called the Grossglockner, a narrow, winding, spectacular road that rises to over 12,000 feet and descends in a series of hairpin turns so tight and so dramatic that they seem to exist primarily as a test of what both machine and driver are made of. It was, in the early years of the 911's life, a road that Ferry Porsche drove regularly, a road that the engineers used for development testing, a road that the car was built, implicitly and explicitly, to master. If you go there today and wait long enough, you will hear it before you see it. The sound carries differently in the mountains. It bounces off the rock walls and arrives from unexpected directions, building before the car appears around the corner, lingering after it has disappeared from sight. And when it comes around that final hairpin and opens up on the straightaway below the summit, and the driver, whoever they are, a collector, an enthusiast, someone who has saved for years for this moment, drops 2 gears and presses hard on the flat pedal, the sound rises through that impossible register, that voice between mechanical and musical, and for a moment, every other sound in the world falls away. The rear-engined layout, they said, was wrong. The air-cooled engine, they said, couldn't last. The handling, they said, would kill you. The company, they said, couldn't compete. All of it. Every doubt and every objection and every expert opinion that suggested firmly and reasonably that this car should not work, all of it, swept away by a sound that carries for miles in the mountain air, making the case, as it has made the case every day since September 1964, that the best things in this world are never the ones that made the most sense on paper. They are the ones that were made against all reasonable odds with complete and unconditional love.